We're going to talk about extra label drug use. Can anybody give me a feel for how much of your practice, if you're doing recommendations for treatment, would be related to extra label drug use? Just to help the audience get a feel for how big of an issue this is. Yeah. Some like in 10% maybe, or?
Hard to see 10%.
Okay. Anybody else? It's hard as veterinarians to really know how much, because honestly, much of what is done is under our direction and not necessarily by us, especially as we start dealing with larger farms. And so my background in practice in the last 7 years was dairy farms in typically in excess of 1,000 cows, up to 9,000 cows. So obviously I don't have the time to be doing all the treatments that are associated with all those farms. So much of this stuff is done on my direction underneath a protocol, some type of a written mechanism. But I was thinking about this as I put the presentation together and as I've done this talk for my students and whatnot through the years. And I suspect that if we're strictly talking about some common diseases such as metritis or pneumonia, it's fairly small. But when we start getting into pain control, for example, there's nothing labeled. So one of the biggest welfare issues that we have in the dairy industry, and I can only talk about the dairy industry with much expertise because I'm a dairy practitioner, okay? I like pork, I like beef, but I just have been away from it for so long that I don't consider myself an expert when it comes to what they do on a regular basis. So pain control 100%. Mastitis therapy, we start getting into systemic treatments for mastitis therapy, that's 100%, even though we have tons of intramammary tubes. And I suspect that it also goes down to the level of what you consider extra label, in that many of the mastitis tubes, the intramammary tubes, are labeled for specific pathogens. And in many cases, we don't know what pathogen we're treating. We're just treating a disease, which is what recommended as inflammation in the case of mastitis. So I would suspect that somewhere 10% is probably pretty accurate, maybe upwards of 30 or 40% of all of the therapies that happen on dairy farms and other farms across the country are treated underneath an extra label manner. And I also work in the regulatory side. I represent the veterinary industry at the National Conference of Interstate Milk Shipments, and so the milk residue prevention side. And in 2014 and 15, there was a national survey done of 1,800 dairy farms looking at a series of drug residues, some legal, some extra label, a couple that would be considered to be illegal. And they found, I believe it was 15 farms that had positive residues on a fairly sensitive assay. Unfortunately for the survey, I mean, it was good that it was relatively low, and the FDA stated that the milk supply is relatively safe. The big black eye that we took away from that, and as I took personally being involved with this organization, is that all of the residues were extra label. And so many of my colleagues who sit on the Appendix N committee, which is the drug residue avoidance group or testing group within the NCMS, said we need to eliminate extra label drug use. It's like, do you have any concept of what that really means? It sounds very simple. But when we start talking about trying to mandate something that's been commonplace in the veterinary industry for many, many years, legal for a little over 20 years now, it's going to put us in a position where we have a welfare concern on our farms, and that we're not able to deal, number one, with pain in any manner, and many of the other maladies that animals are exposed to and come down with diseases if we don't have a mechanism to utilize these drugs in an extra label manner. So that's my little soapbox. Kind of go through some background of it, and then get into the end of the talk. We'll start talking about some examples of what I mean when we start talking about extra label drug therapy. Okay. So extra label drug therapy is codified in the Federal Register underneath the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act. We all hear of it as AMDUCA, which is the acronym, which essentially took all veterinarians who were practicing extra label drug use, which is essentially every veterinarian in the country doing any food animal work for certain, and it made it legal for me now to do it. I practiced for 1 year doing illegal extra-label drug therapy because there was no mechanism described at the federal level to allow us to do this legally. So I'm legal again. So yes, I have practiced illegal drug therapy, I guess, if you look at it that way. So the important term is that the practice is allowed by licensed veterinarians or under the direction of veterinarians. Probably the better word to use there. Okay, yeah, and I got that next slide. One of the key components of extra-label drug therapies, it requires that I and my producer, my client, have what we call a valid veterinary client-patient relationship in place. And if anybody's been involved with the VFD or this over the years, you have heard you've heard about VCPRs associated with the Veterinary Feed Directive. And you may know that every state has a different VCPR. So the one that we have in Iowa is much different than the one in Tennessee, for example. And some states actually are governed by the federal document, at least underneath the VFD rules, because the federal government didn't find those individual states' state VCPR definition to be to their liking. So they mandated that for the VFD you had to follow the federal VCPR. I'm sorry, I'm getting my acronyms mixed up. Needed to follow the federal VCPR definition. So we had a conversation. I work with a group of about 10 or 12 clinical veterinarians, many of us doing a ton of production animal work. So we had a conversation, since we were going to be the people delivering this material out to the audiences and to our students and whatnot. What does that mean in the state of Iowa? You know, the VCPR in the state of Iowa is very vague. It has some statements about needing to know about the animals and whatnot, and have they be readily available to follow up and all that stuff. And so we decided to have a conversation with our state veterinarian. And he gave us an opinion about what he thought the VCPR means. And then I did a similar talk to this on the VFD for Global Vet Link back in September at the IVMA meeting. And the head of the veterinarian who heads the veterinary practice group in the state of Iowa said, "Oh, I'm not sure that's right." So even in the regulatory component in the state of Iowa, they don't even agree what the VCPR means. So there's a lot of discussion about that. So we've chosen to be conservative. We apply a rule that we have to be on farms at least every 6 months in order for us to have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship, in some cases more, but it's a minimum of 6 months. And in our practice at Iowa State, our ambulatory practice at Iowa State, we actually enforce that, and clients actually have taken that pretty well. I've been surprised by that one. It's not a mechanism to allow us to make more money. It's a mechanism to keep us all out of trouble. Within the AMDUCA requirements, it does state that a careful diagnosis must be made. Again, going back to my comment about trying to do extra label drug use when you have Hispanic gentlemen and white employees on farms and whatnot doing the therapies. Getting to the point of a careful diagnosis is often difficult, okay, because they're looking at clinical signs. The cow is triste, she's sad, she's not milking, whatnot, and trying to get to the definition of metritis or mastitis. Mastitis is easy. Pneumonia, whatnot, is oftentimes difficult. So part of this whole process is having a set of protocols in place, having training in place so they understand what the difference is in mastitis, severity of mastitis, things like that. This can only be done with FDA-approved drugs or animal or human drugs. And it's for therapeutic purposes only. So if an animal's health is suffering or threatened, we can go in an external manner. But if it's not, if it's for production, promotion of increased production, then that's not allowed. Okay? And there's a couple other requirements going forward too. And then there's specific record requirements within the 21 CFR 530, which is the Federal Register document that it describes AMDUCA, that describes the record-keeping requirements that the veterinarian must undertake as far as what needs to be recorded with these treatments. But there's no specific on-farm, or the farm themselves do not have to comply with those records. Okay, so one of the problems with this is that we as veterinarians are required to complete the records, But if there's ever an investigation of a drug residue that goes back to the farm, oftentimes the veterinarian's not notified, the veterinarian's not present, and the FDA inspector will come on the farm and start talking to the producer and ask him, where's your records? And make the leap that these records apply to the farms also. So we try to get our producers to keep the level of records on the farm that we're required to keep as the veterinarian, but there's no specific requirement for that. So it makes it a little bit sticky in the whole process of administration and regulation associated with this. The AMDUCA requirements are only for drugs parentally or administered parentally or in water. Okay, we cannot use extra label drugs. We cannot go with extra label usage of feed grade antimicrobials in the major species. Okay, so when I say the major species, I'm talking about cattle, swine, chickens, and turkeys. There's one fish species, is there not? Horses. Is there a fish species? Do you know? No? Okay. Okay. I thought there was one, like shrimp or something like that, that was major. So it's the major producing species where the extra label requirements are restricted in feed. When we get into the minor species, we have a compliance document in the minor use species which allows us to go into extra label use with the VFD, and I assume we'll be talking more about that later as we go forward, so I won't spend much time there. And then it cannot result in a violative food residue or residue that may affect public health. Okay, and I underline the violative because that term is different depending upon the species that we're dealing with. Okay, so if an antimicrobial is labeled for a particular food producing class, okay, and let's say it's beef animals. Okay, so it can be steer, it can be feedlot animals, it could be a beef cow. There is a withdrawal time associated with that goes back to a legal, what we call a tolerance, okay? And that is an amount of residue that can be present in that tissue at slaughter that is legal. Okay, it's non-violative if it's below that level. However, if we use it in an extra label manner into a species that's not on the label, so let's say I have a antimicrobial, it's a respiratory antimicrobial, and it's labeled for beef animals but not for lactating dairy cattle. Okay, if I give that same antimicrobial in an extra label manner to a lactating dairy cow, the residue has to be non-detectable. I cannot apply the legal tolerance to the dairy cow because that class is not listed on the label. Okay, so I can take two exactly the same size animals with the same malady and treat them exactly the same, one being a dairy cow, one being a beef cow, and I've got a legal tolerance in the beef animal. I have a zero tolerance, and whatever you can define that as is essentially what's detectable in that dairy animal. So when I, as a dairy practitioner, apply extra label drug use, and especially when I get into using drugs that have a labeled withdrawal time for a beef animal, which they're all bovines, right? Legally, they're different, so I need to apply potentially a longer withdrawal time and explain to my producer why that's important. I can't use the 18 days that may be stated on the label. We need to go longer because if that animal happens to be tested and checked for residue at the processing plant, we have a zero tolerance here for the residue. Okay, so I just want to kind of stick on this point just a little bit because when we start talking about residues and start talking about antibiotic free, okay, those are tough levels to get to. Antibiotic free can be very difficult when we start looking at the technology we have in the chemistry labs in the United States today. Okay, I work for one of those labs in the diagnostic lab at Iowa State. Okay, and just to give you an example, we probably shouldn't have this recorded, but I've never used cocaine in my life. Honest to God. Okay, maybe it was good I recorded this. But if I would submit a cocaine sample, or a urine sample, to our diagnostic lab and they would run it for cocaine, they can pick up enough residue through me handling dollar bills. Okay, I absorb enough cocaine residue through my system that in times they can find cocaine in my urine. Okay, and it's not uncommon for the horses at racetracks to be cocaine positive. It's not because they're giving cocaine to the horses, because cocaine usage is quite common amongst the handlers of horses at racetracks. Okay, so we start to think about what do we mean by zero when we start to think about these residue chemistry tests that we can do on farm. Antibiotic free is not always the same. It's oftentimes not the same as talking about a non-violative situation. Okay, so for example, in milk, ceftiofur, the most commonly used antimicrobial in the dairy industry, has a tolerance of 20 parts per billion. Below that, it's non-violative. It is not antibiotic free. Okay, so we need to be careful as we start to use the terminology. I follow the withdrawal time. Okay, and I'm putting that cow back in the tank. Her milk still has some antibiotic in it. Okay, milk's not antibiotic free. It's legal. It's not potentially antibiotic free. Okay, so I think we need to be careful as we go forward talking about that, because we can be proven wrong with the right machine and a good chemist. The clock's messing me up because it's still on Central Time.
Oh, this is freaking out.
So within AMDUCA, there are certain restrictions, and there are a number of antimicrobials that are completely prohibited from use, so we cannot go into an extraordinary manner. So many of these have been illegal for a long period of time, chloramphenicol since the 1980s, I understand. Many of the other ones for maybe less time than that. The sulfonamide antimicrobials have an interesting label in that they're only allowed to be used in lactating dairy cows in an extraordinary manner up until they reach 20 months of age, okay? And then in these three antimicrobials, which only the first one is even available in the United States, we can use on-label indications, on-label doses. So sulfodimethoxine, Albon, is only allowed to be used in pneumonia and foot rot in lactating dairy cattle, which defines as any dairy breed animal more than 20 months of age. And up until about, this has been present for probably 15 or more years now, and up until a couple years, I would always get a veterinarian come up and argue that point with me. So I think we're finally starting to get that one out there. No extra label use of fluoroquinolones in the industry at all. And then glycopeptides and phenylbutazone also have some restrictions on them. The most recent prohibition we have was issued by the FDA in 2012, which was the extra label use of cephalosporins. Again, this is a major use species restriction in that we can only use it for disease prevention purposes. We cannot use it in unapproved doses, frequencies, durations, and routes of administration. And the drug is not approved for a species or production class. Okay, so we can't use human label cephalosporins or small animal label cephalosporins in these major producing classes. With the restriction of the cephalosporins. Now there's some limits. The cefepira, the first generation cephalosporins are not included here. So really, when we start talking about this in the bovine world, we're talking about the ceftiofur product. And it's been limited to only extra label indications, essentially. Okay, so we're pretty much stuck on doses, frequencies, durations, and routes of administration on label, but indications now we can still use in an extra label manner. Okay, this is probably one of the most difficult conversations we've had with producers over the years, with veterinarians over the years, as far as getting them to understand where we're at with prevention and treatment, prevention and control, and even on the VFD side, that whole conversation has come back up again. Okay, so in order to prevent a residue or minimize a residue, there is an organization that's funded by the government called FARAD, Food Animal Residue Avoidance Database, which is it's a collaborative effort of a few universities in the United States, particularly Davis, Kansas State, in North Carolina State, and we participate remotely in doing some of the testing that maybe producers or veterinarians are looking for. But veterinarians can go to FAIRAD and list down what you did. And either inadvertently somebody made a mistake, like your client inadvertently gave new floor to a lactating dairy cow because they thought it'd be good for pneumonia, my client, or something that you're going to do in an external manner. Fred will take and search the literature and give you a best guess estimate of how long that animal needs to be withheld to get down to the tolerance or to a no test positive level. And these are typically fairly conservative estimates. Obviously, they're trying to keep everybody out of trouble. So this resource is out there. It's not somebody you call up on the phone. Most of their information is transmitted via the internet. You go in and put a question on the web. And typically they get back to you in 24 hours. So it's pretty timely usually. And I found it to be very useful when it comes to minimizing our risk for residues on farms. Okay. So when we do have a residue at either in the meat side, USDA is the people that detect the residues in the plants. They transmit that information to the FDA, and oftentimes, in better than 50% of the cases, the farm where the residue originated from has the luxury of being visited by the FDA for 1 to 2 days, and they have the opportunity to look at everything the producer is doing related to production of protein. So this is a cut from one of the letterheads from one of the FDA warning letters. These typically come out 3 to 6 months or so after the investigation happened. They're freely available through FOIA. You can sign up to get these. Every Sunday I get my little email. I go read my FDA warning letters. Okay? It's my little thing to keep me entertained. They're fairly straightforward. They tell you all the information. I've blocked out the farm name and address and stuff like that, but that's all available there. The only thing that they do not include typically is the cow ID information or the animal ID information. So the back tag and the ear tag, I guess that's to protect the innocent. But the information's all there, and as you read through those, you can get a pretty good idea of what the farm did. In almost every case of a FDA warning letter, it's an extra label drug use that didn't follow through on the AMDUCA requirements. In almost all the cases, there is a statement within there that they didn't follow their veterinarian's recommendations. Okay, so it's become fairly commonplace that producers know these drugs are used extra label. They've been doing it for a long period of time. But the problem is they don't really understand the concept of the veterinarian is the one that's responsible for it and takes a lot of the heat when it comes right down to it from a regulatory standpoint. But they're not allowed to essentially do just anything. And so there's a specific set of requirements and expectations by the FDA, meaning that they want that done under the direction of or by a veterinarian. Okay, so we need to have either the treatment's all done by veterinarians, which again is not practical, or on written protocols, and that's where we come in and try to keep our clients in compliance by setting up these protocols to the farm, so they have a pretty specific set of treatments. Pretty much try to get it down to cookbook. Cow comes in, she's got mastitis. This is what we do. Okay, we might even go into some severity scores and whatnot, but that's the direction that much of our treatments are following right now in the industry. So to try to remedy some of that, we've actually started to create these little VCPR documents within our practice. So this is just my version of a VCPR agreement with my clients. Okay? It has absolutely no legal binding whatsoever. It's just meant to start the conversation, to have a piece of information on hand on the farm in case they're asked. They can validate it. And some of my dairy clients, they're required to validate now if they have a VCPR within the farm program and whatnot. But mostly it's to take a piece of paper out to the farms and say, okay, we're going to have a valid VCPR. And you're going to know we have a valid VCPR, and you're going to understand why we have a valid VCPR. Okay? It doesn't restrict them from using me from using other veterinarians for services. It's just to start the conversation. Okay? And I have 4 regular herd health clients, of which I write scripts for 2. Okay. And I do other things on the other farms. And the one client has gotten to the point now, and the other one's the university dairy, has gotten to the point now, is like, hey, our VCPR agreement's over a year old. We need to talk about this. Our protocols are over a year old. So all kind of ties together. So they've got it in their system. They just know. Okay. So basically all this is just a little, a document says we have an agreement. It talks about, I couldn't get it all included, what the state's requirements are. And then basically I just sign off that I'm going to act in this manner. Okay. And these are the species, and this is the information that we're going to cover. Okay. This is similar to what the state of Wisconsin has done with their food armor program. It's an excellent program. So if you're involved in food residue prevention, the food armor program that the Wisconsin Veterinary Medical Association has put together is a component of it that is validating the VCPR. So I'd highly recommend that. One of the things that we're seeing statements come out from McDonald's, from Walmart, is that they're going to want to have producers start to sign off on what their animals are treated with. They understand that animals get sick. They think it's in the best welfare, and that this is a great understanding. It's in the best welfare of those animals to be able to undergo veterinary treatment, whether it's by the veterinarian or it's by the producer on the farm. But they want to have a chain of information available that says this animal was treated or these animals were not treated, and this is what they're being treated on. And so we actually just got this the other day from one of our producers who sells through Cargill, one of our beef producers. One of my beef colleagues was out on farm. And basically it's a verification statement that says that their animals are treated underneath the VFD guidance. They have a valid VCPR. They're handled appropriately. And so this is the first that our practice has been actually asked by a beef or a meat producer to verify the VCPR and to verify that they're feeding all their feed grade antimicrobials underneath the VFD. Okay? So just to give you a little bit of reference, this doesn't apply just to food animal practitioners. Okay? One of the more common reasons that AMDUCA is violated is actually the backyard pet goat or other food animal species that's a pet. Okay? Still, because it's a food animal species, it has to fall underneath AMDUCA. So when I do this is my little slide for all the small animal veterinarians in the room, because I do this talk to 145 veterinary students, of which 75% are going to do small animal medicine. They just don't understand why the hell they're in this room. This is why. Okay? Because the FDA still considers the species to be the use. Okay, so if it's a pot-bellied pig and nobody's ever going to eat it, if it's a backyard goat, nobody's ever going to eat it, it still has to fall underneath the same guidelines of AMDUCA as it would with it being a food-producing species. So Baytril is commonly used in the industry because it's a broad-spectrum, fairly effective antimicrobial. It's also used in the medical profession because it's a broad-spectrum, fairly effective antimicrobial. And so it's one of the medically important antimicrobials and one of the most abused antimicrobials in the industry also from that standpoint because it does have no extra label use in the industry. Okay, some examples of AMDUCA. Simply changing the dose. Okay, the most common thing that maybe it's going to be becoming a little bit less that probably gets producers into trouble is they go to the local farm store, feed store, and they buy a bottle of penicillin. On the label it says 1 ml per 100 pounds, but everybody knows back since the beginning of time, or at least since I graduated, that that's not an effective labeled dose, and we're doing 3 to 5 mils per 100 pounds, right? I don't have to get it from the veterinarian. Maybe it's got advantage, maybe it doesn't, but when they take that home and they start using that on that 3 mil per 100 pound label, they're now practicing extra label drug use. And that usage, while they didn't get it from the veterinarian, still needs to be governed underneath AMDUCA. So this is a very common misperception that happens with anything that's purchased from a feed store or not through a veterinarian. In the dairy industry, we often use the hormone oxytocin for milk letdown. We also use it for difficult calving procedures. And I actually have seen in one of the warning letters a dairy producer written up for illegal extra label use of oxytocin. Because if you look at the label, and I've got a label here, got a little bit closer cut here, it says for milk letdown, you give 1/2 to 1 ml of oxytocin to get her to let her milk down. Now, when I do this talk with a whole room of veterinarians, I first ask, what's the dose of oxytocin? And it's 5. That's what we've all used forever because that's a number, right? It's a round number. Well, in this situation, the producer actually got written up for illegal extra use of oxytocin, absolutely no antimicrobial residue potential here whatsoever, but they were using it in an extra label manner because they were giving 5 ml to their cows for milk letdown. So the inspector read it off as being a enhancement of production and cited the dairy in the warning letter for AMDUCA violations for enhancement of production. Frequency of the intermammary tubes is common. This one, SpectraMast LC, happens to be one of the ceftiofur products, one of the more commonly used, or probably the most commonly used intermammary tube in the United States. And with the now cephalosporin ban, we can't use that in any extra label manner. Okay. Going a different route, so taking flunixin, for example, which is an anti-inflammatory, instead of giving an IV, give it IM, because it's a lot simpler to pull that out of the bottle for a producer and pop it in the muscle than it is to have to tie your head up and put it in the vein. So while it's simpler, it's not very smart from a meat safety issue, from a residue quality assurance component, and it's also illegal. Okay. We'll skip over that. Okay, changing withholding times. This is not following milk withholding for fresh cows after dry cow treatment. Okay, that's a common one that happens in the dairy industry. You'll have dry cow tubes that have a 96-hour milk withdrawal, and they'll commonly just put them in the tank because the solution to pollution is dilution. Okay. Changing the duration of therapy, going more than 7 days with Polyflex and ampicillin injectable. It's not illegal. Okay, I can go 8 days, I can go 9 days. Now I'm in a situation where I'm in an extra label manner.